Our next speaker is Paul Mullins. Paul is a professor of anthropology at Indiana University, Purdue University, Indianapolis, and a docent of American historical archaeology at the University of Oulu. Please help me, is that how you say it? Oulu in Finland. His research examines the relationship between race and material culture, which includes work on the African American experience of consumer culture since 1850 and the 20th century displacement of African American communities by urban renewal. He is the past president of the Society for Historical Archaeology and the author of several books, including Race and Affluence, an Archaeology of African American and Consumer Culture, and the Archaeology of Consumer Culture. Please welcome Paul to the podium.
Thank you very much, Meredith. In 2007, the Baltimore Sun reported on the preservation of the mid-19th century home of free blacks John and Maria Maynard, a project that began nearly 20 years before. The Sun observed that John Maynard's life and home, quote, offer a window into how middle-class blacks made a way in early Annapolis, a city where blacks and whites, slave and free, lived cheek by jowl, end quote. In 2003, a historian conducting research on the household had sounded a similar note when she described John Maynard as, quote, a very conscientious man who adapted his ways to the white world. This is a man who has decided to some extent, when in Rome, do what the Romans do. This is an imagination of free black life and broader African American materiality that focuses on middle-class civility and how African Americans secured citizen privileges despite the very un-American realities of racism. My interest is in how archaeologists and preservationists have focused on African American demonstrations of social and material conformity. This is less to reject the ideological appeals of citizenship or well-documented free black ambition than it is to illuminate how archaeologists interpret the public dimensions of material visibility, and in turn how free blacks imagined what we might circumspectly call middle-class citizenship. Citizenship is an ambiguous, imagined ideal that has been leveraged in the service of a host of social and ideological interests, and the narrative of middle-class civility told in 21st century heritage discourses risks distorting the Maynard's imagination of citizenship and experience of free black life across the color line in the mid-19th century. There's an archaeological tendency to reduce nearly all consumption to a theatrical display of conformity to social and material ideals. Material trappings hazard being reduced to props wielded in public shows of social suitability that secure their consequence as a result of being seen in public space. There was certainly a dimension of materiality that was a dialogue in which free blacks demonstrated their suitability to citizenship. But we might also examine how the consequence of free black materiality was rooted in imagination, a soliloquy that used things to quietly, if not silently, imagine African American life. This does not dismiss the meanings of free black materiality in antebellum white public space, but it encourages us to ask how material things were significant in African American imagination rather than as displays of conscientious conformism adapting to an implicitly white public sphere. This move should narrate materiality in African American introspection and imagination, as well as a host of public spheres, without fixating on the visibility and theatricality associated with white public space. Sometime in the late 1850s, the Maynards sealed a deposit in their backyard containing several political campaign symbols. Nobody in the Maynard household had the right to vote, but of course African Americans closely watched partisan politics at a moment when black freedom was a very tenuous experience. The deposit's contents included an 1840 medallion from the William Henry Harrison campaign and an 1851-56 Whig log cabin glass flask, both drawing their symbolism from the mid-century political party. Harrison became the first Whig president in 1841, only to die a month into his term. The Whigs were the most powerful party in 1840 Southern Maryland, and while Harrison was superficially caricatured as an abolitionist by the Democrats, his campaign and the Whigs held little for free blacks to celebrate. Harrison had nearly nothing to say on slavery, and he believed slavery should be determined by each state. By the time the flask was produced, the Whigs were disintegrating as a national political force, losing the 1852 election to Franklin Pierce. Pierce ran in fierce opposition to abolition and would fan regional tensions by approving the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854 and supporting the Fugitive Slave Act. But the same deposit containing the Maynard's Whig items also contained a Franklin Pierce pipe from that 1852 election. The Democrat Pierce was even more hostile to the political interests of free blacks than the Whigs. So his statements of partisan politics in the hands of African Americans, these things do not provide an especially clear picture of the Maynards' partisanship. However, we might instead look at them as objects of introspection. That is, rather than mechanisms in other directed dialogues or as reflective expressions of political sentiments, these things were soliloquies in the African American imagination that optimistically aspired to participation in the ideal American democracy that has always been undone by its own racism. Rather than fixate on public theatrical materiality, African American imagination, silence, and interiority framed what freedom and citizenship meant to antebellum African Americans. These objects were less about communicating political positioning than they were about imagining an ideal political process that admitted Black American citizenship. The interpretive move to emphasize the importance of introspection certainly does not dispute that social ambitions were publicly expressed in African American materiality, but it tempers the picture of African American materiality as publicly visible conformity, protest, and adaptation, and asks instead how ambition was expressed in African American imagination. John Maynard was born free in Anne Arundel County in about 1810, when Maryland had the largest free black population in the country. Maryland would be home to more free blacks than any slave state until the very abolition of captivity. The anomaly of Maryland's free black population was primarily attributed to the decline of tobacco production throughout northern Maryland after the late 18th century, and cereal agriculture was poorly suited to captive labor. Nevertheless, tobacco production by a very sizable labor force would continue in southern Maryland until the very end of enslavement. When John Maynard received his certificate of freedom in October 1831, captives outnumbered free blacks in Annapolis, but the absolute number of free blacks and their percentage of the Maryland population dwarfed that of every other slave state. By 1850, nearly 75,000 free blacks lived in Maryland, but the state's white majority always considered them likely to incite revolution among captives and worked zealously to control and eliminate them until the very moment of emancipation. In 1830, 458 free blacks and 578 captives were living in Annapolis, and John Maynard married one of those captives, Maria Spencer, sometime before 1834. Maria was held captive by an Annapolitan, Mildred Robinson, who held 5 women and 1 man captive in 1830. In 1834, John purchased Maria's 3-year-old daughter, Phoebe Ann Spencer, from Robinson for $80. In May 1838, John purchased Maria as well from Robinson, and he legally manumitted her on November 2nd, 1840. He and Maria eventually manumitted Phoebe Ann in 1857. John and Maria had their first child, son John Henry, in 1846, and their second, Louis, was born in 1849. The Maynards purchased a property at 163 Duke of Gloucester Street in 1847 for $400. The September 1847 title for the property described it as being with buildings, and it is likely those buildings were incorporated into the house that is still standing at the site today. The surviving house has a single-story frame skeleton that is typical of late 18th century architecture, but archaeological excavation reveals no deposits that date before the 1840s. Sometime around 1837 or 1838, one of Annapolis's most wealthy residents, James Englehart, purchased the Duke of Gloucester Street lot without any structures. Since it was sold with buildings, it seems likely that a single-story structure was moved to the site between its purchase and 1847, when the Maynards purchased the lot. A gable end weatherboard has the date 1837 indistinctly carved into the wood, suggesting the structure was indeed moved there around the time of the lot's purchase by Englehart. The home's value increased from $400 in 1850 to $1,000 in 1860, reflecting that under the Maynard's direction, the house was very extensively remodeled, adding a second story and rear and side additions in the decade before emancipation. When the home was first purchased by a for-profit Annapolis preservation group in 1990, the city's heritage narratives were still conventional celebratory tales spun around the exceptional preservation of 18th century Annapolis and the patriots living in and passing through Maryland's capital city. That narrative almost entirely ignored African American heritage. Architectural scholars pored over the Duke of Gloucester Street house and focused on its meaning as a transformed 18th century structure. Rather than narrate its enormously well-documented post-1847 history as an African American home, the new owners framed its narrative as one of age and origins rooted in an 18th century past among unidentifiable white people. Nevertheless, one preservation hinted at how the free black story would be accommodated to their dominant narrative when he described John Maynard as, quote, an energetic and opportunistic sort, end quote. That is, the Maynards would begin to be narrated as socially disciplined figures whose middle-class advance reflected their clever negotiation of structural inequalities. In this vein, for instance, an architectural historian concluded that Maynard, quote, wasn't going out and buying new lumber, he was being very frugal, end quote. Perhaps the Maynards' recycling of structural elements could be characterized as opportunistic or frugal, but none of these heritage makers fleshed out the lived experience of racism in antebellum Annapolis. Instead, they told a story of the Maynards' social discipline, implicitly at best negotiating racism that was strategically unexamined in preservation rhetoric. We might temper the somewhat shallow picture of successful class climbing by underscoring the enormous structural barriers to their advance and contemplating precisely what it may have meant to be black middle class in the mid-19th century. Like most free blacks, John and Maria Maynard were exclusively involved in service labor for white employers before and after emancipation. Maryland had an enormous surplus of white working class laborers, so nearly all free blacks in Annapolis were similarly committed to domestic and service labor. Like a generation of free black women, Maria Maynard was a laundress in the 1850s, as was her sister-in-law Martha Maynard. Martha and John Maynard's brother David lived in an extension of the Duke of Gloucester Street house and shared the backyard. The two women certainly did laundry in the yard, and the assemblage of sewing implements suggests they likely did similar domestic service labor. The archaeological assemblage from the yard uncovered 285 buttons, most of which were likely lost during washing. 6 Navy and 2 Army buttons produced before 1852 were probably from the uniforms of students and soldiers stationed at the Naval Academy, which was established in Annapolis in 1845. Generations of African American women well into the 20th century would likewise do service labor at the academy and do laundry for white Annapolitan households. John Maynard was a waiter at Annapolis' City Hotel in the 1850s and probably was working at the hotel in the 1830s and 1840s. The City Hotel was among Annapolis' best-known venues catering to legislators in Annapolis for state governmental sessions and planters conducting business in the capital. John Maynard may have been working there in 1845 when he purchased Maria's mother from City Hotel trustee James Englehart, who also sold Maynard the Duke of Gloucester Street lot, which is directly across the street from the City Hotel. In the late 1840s, Maynard was probably one of only 20 or so free black men who owned property in Annapolis, and he had sustained business dealings with white entrepreneurs like James Englehart. One scholar assessing Maynard's long-term employment at the City Hotel suggested, quote, "Where better to learn the ways of the white man than in the dining room where the servants had a good look at the fashions and foibles of white society," end quote. That's actually a reasonable theory about how scores of black captives and service laborers alike crafted the skills to negotiate white public space, but it can't conclude simply with an assumption of black conformism to genteel white discipline. even if such materiality appeared to white observers to be conformism. This illuminates the rich meanings of material visibility along and across the color line and the African American experience of materiality outside white public space. John Maynard died in July 1875, and in February 1876 his household possessions were inventoried for probate. The most valuable item in the front room was a set of 6 mahogany chairs, and it was surrounded by a sofa, sideboard, marble top table, set of pictures, and cane chairs, among a host of items that formed a rather typical genteel parlor. At some level, this certainly paints the Maynards as a genteel household in the immediate wake of freedom, but this was not an assemblage being displayed in public space, and likely too few, if any, white Annapolitans. Even if a dimension of this parlor assemblage fashioned class respectability in the eyes of African American visitors, this is not exclusive to the white, quiet, and even inarticulate ways these things and their social meanings were experienced. Rather than focus on the notion of other-directed visibility, in which people consume things to wield them in public shows of subjectivity or appeals to secure that identity, this was instead a soliloquy that was not about how others saw the Maynards, but instead how they imagined themselves. One of the most apparently innocuous items in the assemblage was this modest hand charm, one of 2 recovered from the assemblage. Hand charms have been linked to a broad range of beliefs, including a dynamic range of Christian, Islamic, and African belief systems, and conjure. James Davidson concedes that hand charms may have been incorporated into hoodoo, conjure in the late 19th and 20th century, but he's very skeptical that these hand motif items are anything other than decorative fashion accents in earlier contexts. Chris Fennell has instead argued for the dynamic meaning of such hand charms, and suggested they were relatively private, if not surreptitious things that may have expressed a vast range of contextually distinctive meanings. We may circumspectly interpret what the charm meant in the Maynard's hands, but since such things appear repeatedly in period assemblages, it seems to support Fennell's argument that the Maynards and many other consumers were dynamically invoking common motifs. The contextual evidence to interpret the Maynard's hand charms does not make a particularly strong case for the things as expressions of faith, but rather than focus on the instrumental use of the thing or the ends toward which the charm may have been wielded, it instead illuminates much of the private imagination of free black life and the broader African American experience. It's challenging to narrate a story of materiality that was perhaps itself never especially articulate, but archaeological material culture is always ambiguous, multivalent, and dynamic. This furtive quiet of things is not necessarily unique to free blacks and African Americans, but there is a case to be made for an African American engagement with materiality that was distinctively introspective dissemblance, crafted from the unique conditions of African American captivity, partial freedoms, and structural racism. That departs from the tendency to privilege public African American expressiveness and see resistance as a politically intentional expression in the public sphere, and instead approaches the free black material world as a contemplative expression of inner imagination that does not feel compelled to seek out selfhood in public expression. Thank you.